What if the person you thought you knew carried a secret life of sacrifices no one ever imagined? That day at the funeral would shatter every assumption. At Willow Hill Cemetery, the air was thick with grief. A hush lingered over the mourners gathered around the fresh grave, their low whispers drifting with the breeze. Family, friends, and neighbors had come together to honor Thomas Gray, a man celebrated for his generosity and kindness, the kind of soul who left warmth wherever he went. His black headstone caught the afternoon sun, polished and gleaming, engraved with the words, "A life of service and sacrifice." Among the grieving faces stood an elderly black woman, unnoticed by most. She hadn't come to draw attention, yet she couldn't be ignored. Her deep green dress draped modestly around her frame, her silver hair tucked neatly beneath a plain hat. In her hands rested a single red rose. Her grip was steady, but her eyes revealed a sorrow heavier than anyone else's in that crowd. While others exchanged condolences, she kept to herself, quietly watching from the edge, her silence carrying more weight than words. When the pastor's final prayer faded into stillness, she began to move. The soft crunch of gravel beneath her shoes echoed in the silence as the crowd instinctively stepped aside. Slowly, she walked to the front, stopping at the casket. She stared at it for a moment, then gently laid the rose on its surface. With a deep breath, she turned to face the crowd. "My name is Clara Jenkins," she said, her voice clear and steady. "I doubt many of you know me, but I knew Thomas in ways none of you ever did." A ripple of shock swept through the mourners. Eyes widened, whispers broke out, and confusion spread. Who was this woman? How could she claim a closeness to the man they all thought they understood so well? Clara's gaze moved across their faces. Calm but unwavering, she stood her ground. "Before this day is over," she continued, "you'll know why I'm here, and you'll come to see the Thomas Gray that most of you never truly knew." Her words lingered like a storm on the horizon. The crowd grew quiet again, every ear straining for what would come next. As the wind rustled through the trees, Clara drew in a deep breath. Her voice carried an authority that silenced even the restless. And in that moment, everyone knew they were about to hear a truth that would change everything. "I first met Thomas half a century ago," Clara began, her eyes softening as though she were staring into the past itself. "Not here in this quiet town, but in Charleston, South Carolina. It was a different world then. A world where someone like me wasn't welcome in certain streets, certain shops, certain lives." The crowd leaned in without realizing it, drawn by the gravity of her words. Her tone carried both pride and heartbreak. Thomas was young then, ambitious, restless. He worked as a teacher, but his heart was somewhere else, deep in the fight for justice. That's where our paths crossed, on the steps of a church where sit-ins were being planned. He stood with me without hesitation, even though it cost him dearly. He risked his livelihood. He faced threats most men would run from. Gasps rippled through the mourners. To them, Thomas had always been the gentle benefactor, the man who gave quietly and smiled easily. None of them had ever heard whispers of this chapter of his life. Before we continue, kindly do us a quick favor. Please hit that like and subscribe button if you are touched by this story. Your support keeps us creating and sharing more powerful stories as this one. Thank you. Now let's get back to our story. Clara let the silence breathe before she spoke again. "We weren't just partners in the struggle," she said, her voice softening. "We became family. When I lost my sister to the hatred of those years, Thomas was there. When he was cast aside by his own for choosing the harder path, I stood with him. Through it all, we carried each other." Her hand trembled slightly as she adjusted her hat, her eyes locked on the casket before her. "We shared meals when we had little, tears when the pain felt unbearable, and stories that kept us going. He called me his sister. Not in name only, but in the way that truly mattered, even when saying it out loud could have put him in danger." The crowd shifted uneasily, trying to reconcile this hidden history with a man they thought they knew, a polished philanthropist, quiet and steady, who never spoke of his scars. "But listen closely," Clara said, her voice tightening with conviction. This isn't just about the battles we fought decades ago. It's about who Thomas became because of them. The kindness you knew, the generosity you admired. It was forged in the fire of those struggles. That's the part of him you never saw. She paused, letting the silence hang heavy in the air, her eyes sweeping over the crowd. The next words she spoke would dig deeper than friendship, revealing sacrifices no one had ever imagined. Clara's fingers tightened around her purse, but her voice stayed firm, steady, and unshaken. I didn't just live through those times, she said. I fought through them. And so did Thomas. But that fight came with a price, scars that most of you never saw. Her piercing gaze locked with the mourners, daring them to look away. In 1967, Thomas lost his job for marching in Atlanta. The school board called it unbecoming conduct. But we knew the truth, it was punishment. Retaliation. Murmurs rippled faintly through the crowd. Clara pressed on. He never told you because he didn't want pity. He packed up what little he had and moved into a small one-bedroom house on Montgomery's south side. He scraped by tutoring children, yet he never once turned his back on the movement. Her voice wavered for the first time. When my house was firebombed for hosting meetings, Thomas was the one who came. Middle of the night, no hesitation. He drove me and my 2 nephews to safety, knowing full well the danger. She turned back toward the casket, her expression softening with memory. That was Thomas. Not the polished man in the fine suit you all knew, but the man who walked through fire for those he loved. The cemetery fell utterly still as she pulled a folded sheet of paper from her purse. Holding it up with trembling hands, she said, This is a letter Thomas wrote to me in 1972. I want to share just one part with you. With care, she opened it and began to read, her voice breaking yet clear enough for all to hear. Clara, you are the sister I chose when life gave me none. We've carried burdens no one should have to carry. But I would shoulder them again for you, without question. You remind me every day that family is not about blood. It's about who stands beside you when the world turns away. Her voice cracked as she finished the last line, and she stopped, steadying herself. The crowd, once stiff and composed, began to shift. Some wiped tears from their eyes, while others stared down at the ground, ashamed they had never known this part of Thomas's life. Thomas never abandoned anyone, Clara said firmly, folding the letter with care. Not even when it cost him everything. But tell me, how many of you knew this? How many of you ever cared enough to ask? Her words lingered like a weight pressing down on them, a truth too heavy to ignore. As silence settled, she drew in a deep breath. What came next would not only shock them, it would forever reshape the way Thomas was remembered. The air itself seemed to grow thick as Clara's tone shifted, laced with both sorrow and defiance. There's one more truth you need to hear, she said, her eyes scanning the crowd. A truth none of you would have imagined, yet one that defined everything he stood for. The mourners leaned in, holding their breath as she continued. Thomas didn't just fight battles in public. He carried a private one for years. A secret he bore quietly, with no one to share the weight. She paused, her voice steady but cutting. Thomas had a son. A boy he couldn't openly claim because of who the mother was. A collective gasp rippled through the cemetery. Clara's gaze swept across the stunned faces, but she pressed on. His son, David, was born to a woman Thomas could never marry, not in that time, not in that place. The child was black, like me, and Thomas kept it hidden, not out of shame, but because he knew the cost. He knew what it would have done to his career, to his place in this community, to the causes he was still trying to fight for. The whispers swelled through the crowd, eyes darting from face to face, disbelief etched on every expression. But Clara wasn't done. I was there the day David was born, she said softly, her voice carrying the weight of memory. Thomas made a promise that day. That boy would never go without. He paid for his schooling, wrote him letters week after week, and visited when he could, always under the cover of night. He gave David what he himself had been denied growing up, a father's love, even if it had to remain hidden. Tears shimmered in her eyes, but her voice held steady. "And David, the son you never knew existed, is here among you today." From the back, a tall man stepped forward. Broad-shouldered, composed, his quiet strength seemed to echo Thomas's own. The resemblance was undeniable, and the crowd fell into stunned silence. David walked up to Clara and laid a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Thank you," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. Clara smiled at him through her tears. "It was always my honor," she whispered. Then, turning back to the mourners, her tone grew firm. "Thomas loved you all in his own way, but his deepest love was reserved for those he fought for, the ones society refused to see. That's why I'm here today, to make sure you finally know the man behind the polished image." The silence that followed was heavy, not just shock, but reflection. A reckoning with truths long buried. Every eye now fixed on David, standing tall beside Clara, a living testament to the sacrifices Thomas had carried in secret. And just as the crowd tried to absorb it all, Clara drew a breath, ready to share one final story, a story of courage that would define Thomas's legacy forever. An elderly man near the front cleared his throat, his voice cracking as it broke the silence. I never knew," he murmured. "Thomas never spoke of any of this." Clara's eyes softened as she turned toward him. "That wasn't who he was," she said gently. "Thomas never looked for praise when he did the right thing. But don't mistake his quietness. He carried those sacrifices with him every single day." A woman, her cheeks streaked with tears, stepped forward uncertainly. "I remember when my father lost his job," she said, her voice trembling. "Thomas helped us. I thought I understood his kindness back then, but now I see it went so much deeper." Clara gave a small nod, her voice steady but full of feeling. "Thomas didn't give because it was easy or convenient. He gave because he knew the pain of going without, and he never wanted anyone else to carry that burden." The crowd began to stir, whispers and fragments of memories surfacing. Each story added another layer to Thomas's legacy, revealing a man shaped not by ease, but by hardship. Alongside the stories came an unspoken weight, guilt. Many realized they had only known the polished version of Thomas, the man in the fine suit, never the one who hid his struggles behind it. From the back, a young man finally spoke, his voice tight with emotion. "It isn't fair," he said, his fists clenched. "He should have been honored for everything, not just the pieces we chose to see." Clara looked at him with quiet compassion. "You're right," she said softly. But Thomas never cared about recognition. What mattered to him was impact. His true legacy isn't in plaques or awards, it's in the lives he touched. Yours. Mine. And David's. David stepped forward then, his voice low but unwavering. "My father always told me a person's worth isn't measured by what they leave behind in possessions, but in people. And standing here today, I see he left behind more than I could have ever imagined." Tears flowed freely now, not only for Thomas's passing, but for the truth of his hidden sacrifices finally brought to light. As the weight of his story settled over the crowd, Clara knew she had one last memory to share. One final act that would define Thomas's legacy. She clasped her hands tightly, pausing to gather herself as she looked out across the sea of faces. The air was thick, not just with grief, but with a deep respect for the man they were only now beginning to truly understand. 2 months before Thomas passed, she began softly, "He called me. His health was failing, but his spirit was as strong as ever. He told me he was setting up a trust, not for himself, not for his name, but for the children in this community. Children whose families struggle. Children who deserve opportunities, but are so often overlooked." Gasps and murmurs rippled through the mourners, their eyes wide with awe. "He knew he wouldn't live to see it take root," Clara continued, her voice trembling. "But that didn't matter to him. What mattered was planting the seed, ensuring it would grow long after he was gone." David stepped forward, his deep voice carrying steady conviction. "That trust is real," he said firmly. "It's already established. It will fund scholarships, after-school programs, and mentorships for kids who need it most. My father wanted his life to mean more than just what he gave in his lifetime." He wanted it to echo for generations. Clara's gaze swept across the crowd, her eyes meeting theirs one by one. That, she said quietly, was Thomas's greatest gift. He never wanted applause or recognition. All he ever needed was the quiet assurance that he had done his part to make the world just a little better. A deep silence followed, his memory pressing into the hearts of those gathered. Some nodded with misty eyes, others wiped away tears, while a few simply stood still, lost in thought. Clara placed her hand gently on the smooth headstone, her voice soft yet unwavering. "So, I leave you with this. How will you be remembered? Not for the things you owned or the titles you carried, but for the lives you touched and the love you gave." She turned back to the crowd, her gaze kind but steady. If Thomas's life teaches us anything, it's that true legacy isn't carved into stone. It's etched into the hearts of the people you choose to lift. The crowd seemed to exhale as one, the heaviness giving way to quiet reflection. Clara offered David a final nod before stepping aside, allowing the moment to rest. Slowly, mourners began to approach, offering words of thanks and promises to honor Thomas's memory. The cemetery, once filled only with grief, now carried a sense of renewed purpose. If this story touched you, let it serve as a reminder. Acts of kindness and sacrifice may go unseen, but they are never forgotten. Live in a way that leaves a mark on others. And if you'd like to keep hearing stories like this, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.